Audio made possible by www.jackettome.com. Audio Fanfiction Productions presents Wide Awake. Fanfiction written by Angscotta003. Fanfiction inspired by The Twilight Saga written by Stephanie Meyer. Chapter 7. Bittersweet Butterscotch. Bella's point of view. Edward liked vegetable soup a lot. I sat on his black leather couch watching utter fascination as he greedily consumed the steaming bowl of soup, in the middle of his large bed, still wrapped in a blanket. It was as if he hadn't eaten in days. The thought made me frown. I inspected his room once again from my spot, noting the towering heap of tissues spilling over the wastebasket beside the bed. The room was slightly more cluttered than last time I was here. More clothing and papers and books strewn about carelessly. I felt ridiculously intrusive, just climbing up to his room like it wasn't an extreme invasion of privacy. Feeling forlorn about my behavior, I decided to do something that would probably just annoy him further. "I'm sorry about just barging up here," I apologized quietly. "I was just worried about you being sick, and all." Edward's head snapped up from his steaming bowl of soup, and he narrowed his bloodshot eyes at me.
"What did I say about that shit?"
he rasped out, trying to sound annoyed and angry, but coming out extremely nasal. The edges of my lips twitched in response to the hilarity of hardcore Edward Cullen sounding a lot like a 12-year-old girl. He softened his face and rolled his eyes at my amusement, while diving back into the bowl of soup.
"I don't mind. The soup is fucking delicious. Plus, I felt bad about leaving you out there all alone last night."
He frowned. I proceeded to tell him about how I knew he wasn't coming, and stayed inside the house, which seemed to console him a bit. So I continued watching him devour the soup, and couldn't get past the irrational fear that Edward wasn't being cared for properly. "Doesn't Carlisle ever make you soup, or anything?" I asked, prying more than I probably should, but trying to squash the irrational concern I was feeling. Edward snorted at his spoon and shrugged.
"He brought me some hospital food, but it tasted like ass."
I nodded in understanding. Me and hospital food had a long history as well.
Carlisle is a shitty cook. And I'm probably the only person on the planet that can completely fuck up toast.
He chuckled thickly, and then began a mild coughing fit that made me cringe. But my spirits were mildly lifted. Edward didn't have anyone in his life to make him good food or bring him soup when he was sick. Until now. I smiled a little. That was one thing I could happily do for Edward, and well. When he was done with his soup, I produced the bag of cookies, and tossed them on his bed. His eyes lit up a little bit at the sight of them, and it made me smile. He loved my cookies. We settled into a revised version of our routine, being in his room instead of the gazebo, rather comfortably. He tossed me the iPod, alerting me to a new album he got. I love it, of course, nodding along to the heavy drum beats and slightly industrial sound of the music with a smile. I didn't realize exactly how much I missed my night with Edward until that moment, sitting on a black leather couch, and watching him sketch away in his book comfortably while talking to me about his newly acquired album. It was only the second time ever I had seen him without his signature black leather jacket, and even though he looked miserable with his red nose and gruff stubble, he was still gorgeous. There was one lock of hair that kept falling into his eyes, and my fingers were still doing the pathetically annoying twitching thing, wanting to smooth it back. We spent the entire night like that. I never moved from my spot on the sofa, still feeling slightly uneasy about invading his privacy, while he sketched and talked to me in his pitiful nasal tone. I eventually alerted myself to the alarm clock on Edward's bedside table, and realized 5 hours had gone by. It was amazing how time always flew by when I was with him at night chatting so comfortably. With a sigh, I zipped my bag back up and lifted myself off the sofa, slinging it onto my back, and drawing up my hood. Edward looked almost as disappointed as I did about my departure when he looked up from his sketchbook. "I have to go now, before Esme wakes up, but I'll come back tomorrow with more soup." I said nervously as more of a question than a statement, fiddling with the sleeves of my hoodie. He smiled a bit before his face fell.
I don't know how I feel about the idea of you scaling 3 stories.
At what was probably the blatant look of disappointment on my face, he added.
I mean, I'd never fucking forgive myself if you got hurt doing it.
The thought of Edward being protective of my safety made me near giddy, but I contained my excitement by rolling my eyes at him. You don't have to worry about me, I scoffed, waving my sleeved hand in a dismissive fashion. You should have seen me, I was like a pro, I added proudly, clasping my hands behind my back and rocking on my heels. Edward chuckled darkly, shaking his head.
Well, as long as my juvenile delinquent ways are corrupting you safely, I wouldn't mind.
I smiled at him, happy he wanted me to return and cross the room to the door, before something occurred to me. Hey, I said, turning around to face him. What's Jasper's favorite color? I asked cryptically with a smirk on my face. Edward raised his eyebrows at me questioningly, but I just stood waiting with my hand on the doorknob.
Green,
he said, slowly narrowing his eyes. I nodded and turned back around, waving behind me. Thanks, see you tomorrow. I chuckled menacingly as I slipped out of the French doors and back to the balcony. I climbed down rather skillfully to my surprise, landing with a quiet thump on the soft ground. It was really quite thrilling. Stalking around in the darkness, doing something so bad. I shook my head at myself and returned home in lifted spirits, knowing Edward was okay. Esme had been subtly dropping hints to me all week about Thanksgiving. At first I didn't understand, but this morning it all came together. So, Esme started casually while flipping through an interior design magazine on the couch next to me. Did you want to cook for Thanksgiving, dear? She asked. I nodded enthusiastically when she glanced up from her lap. I've never had the chance to do something so big. And a holiday with Alice was sure to be somewhat extravagant. I was already getting ideas for all kinds of new recipes. That's good, she ate distractedly while still flipping. I cooked last year, she continued in a bored tone. Too bored. We invited the Cullens over. She shrugged. Of course the sound of that name piqued my full attention. Really? I mused quietly, trying to imagine Edward sitting at the dining room table we never used, sitting across from Alice, and hating every second of it. Yes, it was quite lovely. She smiled, and got a wistful gleam in her brown eyes. Okay, I said, slowly, not really understanding the point. She resumed flipping after shaking off whatever she was remembering that made her smile. Would you be terribly opposed if we invited them again? She looked over at me with a cautious expression. I wouldn't want to make you uncomfortable. She finished with tight eyes crinkling at the edges. Oh. She was worried about the men being in the house. Oh, Esme. I breathed, closed my eyes and shook my head. Please don't change any holiday traditions on account of me, I pleaded in a whisper. She took my hand in hers, looking down at it with pity. This again? Don't be ridiculous, dear. You are far more important to me than any stupid tradition, she whispered sweetly. It always made me smile when she showed me this kind of affection. It was so rare for me to get any affection at all. It's fine, Esme. It won't bother me, I said with a confident smile. I wouldn't let my issues affect Esme like that. She wanted the Cullens over for Thanksgiving. And Edward might come. That was plenty incentive for me. She looked skeptical, so I added with as much enthusiasm as my tired brain could muster, plus, think of all the food I'll be able to make with them it being here. I chuckled, imagining him eating 2 turkeys all to himself. With a long sigh, she patted my hand lovingly and nodded, resuming to her lazy Sunday activity. That afternoon, Alice was subjecting me to her favorite brand of hedonistic torture: shopping. I wouldn't have gone at all, but there were still plenty of essentials that I had yet to purchase since my move to Forks. So I spent most of the afternoon following her around the mall in Port Angeles, dragging my tired feet behind me.